Imagine a cold stone dungeon, the stench of sweat, blood, and fear thick in the air. A condemned man kneels in chains, surrounded by guards, priests, and curious townsfolk eager to witness his fate. This was not modern death row, this was the Middle Ages, where executions were not just punishments, but public theater, designed to terrify and control. From slow, torturous deaths on the breaking wheel to sudden beheadings before a roaring crowd, medieval death row was a place where human cruelty was sharpened into ritual. These were not just executions, they were spectacles of power, shame, and fear. And for those condemned, there was no escape from the nightmare that awaited. This is the haunting story of death and punishment in the medieval world. When we imagine death row today, we think of sterile prison cells, endless legal appeals, and long years of waiting. But in the medieval world, death row was something entirely different, an immediate, tangible, and suffocating presence. It was not a drawn-out process, it was a countdown to certain death. The condemned were often thrown into dark, foul-smelling dungeons beneath castles, town halls, or even churches. These cells were not designed for comfort or even survival. They were designed to break the spirit before the execution itself. Rats crawled along damp floors, chains rattled in the silence, and the air reeked of human waste. Some prisoners starved. Others were tortured daily as part of their preparation for execution. In many towns, these dungeons were deliberately placed near marketplaces or public squares, so that common folk could be reminded of what awaited wrongdoers. Unlike modern systems, there were no endless appeals. Once sentenced, the condemned awaited their day, sometimes only for a few days or weeks. This period was not about mercy, it was about spectacle. The community had to be warned, and the church had to sanctify the execution. Priests would visit the cell to remind the prisoner of his sins, urging confession before death. Sometimes forgiveness was granted, but more often priests were there to reinforce the terrifying truth that divine justice demanded blood. The execution itself was considered both punishment and purification. For kings and nobles, executions were a demonstration of power proof that disobedience would not be tolerated. For the church, executions were framed as a chance for the condemned to repent, to cleanse their soul in their final moments. But for the common people, it was something far more primal. It was entertainment, a grim theater where death played out in slow, horrifying detail. Execution days were announced in advance, almost like festivals. Merchants set up stalls, taverns prepared extra ale, and families gathered to watch. Children were brought along, not shielded from the horror, but encouraged to learn from it. The condemned, shackled and pale, was dragged from his cell, paraded through the streets on a cart. This was not only to humiliate him, but to give the public one last chance to spit, jeer, or throw stones. Every step of this procession was meant to strip away dignity and reduce the person to an object lesson in fear. What awaited at the scaffold or execution site depended on the crime. Thieves might face hanging, traitors might be drawn and quartered, heretics burned alive, and rebels broken on the wheel. Each punishment was carefully chosen, not just for its cruelty, but for its symbolism. Hanging lifted the body away from the earth, a sign of rejection from society. Burning reduced a heretic to ashes, a physical erasure of false belief. Beheading severed the head, the very seat of thought and identity. And the wheel, perhaps the most terrifying of all, shattered the body bone by bone before the watching crowd. But before all this, the condemned endured the most haunting part of medieval death row, waiting. Waiting for the day when their name would be called, when the doors would creak open, when the guards would drag them into the sunlight for the last time. Some prayed desperately, others wept, and a few cursed their captors to the very end. In the silence of their cells, surrounded by shadows and chains, they knew that every breath brought them closer to a spectacle of agony. This waiting was a punishment in itself. Medieval chroniclers wrote of prisoners screaming through the night, of men tearing at their chains until their wrists bled, of women collapsing in despair as priests told them to prepare for the fire. Unlike modern executions carried out behind closed doors, in the medieval world, everything was meant to be seen, heard, and remembered. The condemned had one final ritual before their execution, the last confession and the last meal. Confession was not optional. It was demanded by the church. Even those who refused were dragged to the priest, who shouted prayers into their ears as they were led to death. The last meal, far from being generous, was often symbolic bread and wine, representing the body and blood of Christ, a cruel reminder of salvation denied. In rare cases, nobles or wealthy prisoners might receive a feast, but for most, the final taste of life was stale bread and cold water. By the time they were led from their cell, their body was already broken by hunger, fear, and humiliation. Some collapsed before even reaching the scaffold, forcing guards to drag their limp bodies through the jeering crowd. Others tried to stand tall, using their last moments to shout curses or defiance, but all knew that the end was inevitable. Death row in the medieval world was not a place of waiting for justice, it was a place of waiting for pain. A cruel theater where even the silence of the dungeon echoed with the promise of torment. In this way, the medieval death row was far more than just a holding place. It was the first act in the performance of execution, a place where hope was stripped away, where the body was weakened, and where the soul was forced to reckon with its impending end. The cell, the chains, the prayers, the jeers, every moment was a step toward the scaffold, where the condemned would become a public lesson in fear. If the dungeon was the first act of medieval death row, the execution ground was the grand finale. It was where power, religion, and cruelty merged into one horrific performance. To modern minds, it may seem unthinkable, but to people of the Middle Ages, executions were community event spectacles that drew entire towns together. For kings, lords, and bishops, it was the ultimate demonstration of authority. For the condemned, it was a stage upon which they could not refuse to play. The choice of execution method depended heavily on both the crime and the status of the accused. Punishment was not merely about killing, it was about making a statement. Every form of death carried a message, a symbolic warning etched into flesh and bone. For thieves, bandits, and common criminals, hanging was the most frequent end. A crude wooden gallows would be erected in the town square or on a hill outside the city walls. The condemned was forced up a ladder or onto a cart, a noose looped tightly around the neck. Then, with a signal, the cart was pulled away or the ladder kicked aside. Unlike modern hangings designed to break the neck instantly, medieval hangings were slow strangulations. The victim's body twitched violently as the crowd looked on. Children sometimes hoisted onto shoulders to get a better view. The condemned clawed at the rope, face turning purple, until life slipped away. In some towns, bodies were left swinging for days, a rotting warning to others. The gallows was more than wood, and rope, it was a symbol of law carved into the skyline. For traitors and rebels, the breaking wheel was the most feared punishment. The condemned was tied to a large wooden wheel, limbs stretched unnaturally wide. An executioner then brought down a heavy iron bar or hammer upon the arms and legs, snapping bones one by one. The crowd gasped with each crack. Sometimes the wheel was upright, so the body hung grotesquely in public view. Sometimes it was laid flat, the victim writhing as the blows fell. After the bones were broken, the body was left tied to the wheel, raised high on a pole, where crows and dogs finished what the executioner had begun. Death came not from the strikes, but from shock, blood loss, or starvation. Some lingered for days, moaning until their voices were gone. The wheel was not just a tool of execution, it was a ritual of annihilation. Perhaps the most infamous form of medieval execution was burning, reserved for heretics, witches, and those who defied the church, it was a punishment designed to purify by fire. The condemned was tied to a stake, often in the middle of a town square or open field, surrounded by piles of wood and straw. Priests offered one last chance at confession. Then the flames were lit. The fire was often started at the feet, ensuring a slow, agonizing death. The victims screamed as flames climbed higher, smoke choking the air. In some cases, damp wood was used deliberately, creating thick smoke that prolonged suffering. To the church, this was more than execution, it was a symbolic cleansing of sin. To the crowd, it was a spectacle both terrifying and thrilling. For the condemned, it was hell on earth, endured under the open sky, with no escape but ash. Not all executions were drawn out. For nobles or those of high status, beheading was considered the most honorable death. The condemned knelt before a block, head lowered as the executioner raised a sword or axe. If the blade was sharp and the hand steady, death came in an instant. But a clumsy strike meant repeated blows, each one more horrific than the last. Chronicles record nobles requiring 2, 3, even 4 strikes before the head finally fell. Unlike other methods, beheadings were often quiet and solemn, attended by fewer jeers from the crowd. Sometimes, the severed head was held high, a final display of power. Other times, it was mounted on a spike above city gates, left to rot as a warning to all who entered. The Middle Ages were endlessly inventive when it came to cruelty. Some criminals were drawn and quartered, dragged behind horses, hanged until half dead, then cut apart while still alive. Others were boiled in cauldrons of oil, water, or even molten lead. Records speak of a man in France boiled for poisoning, his screams echoing through the market square until silence fell. Still more gruesome were localized punishments, being buried alive, thrown into pits of snakes, or enclosed in iron cages hung from city walls. Each method carried its own dark symbolism, tying crime to consequence in a way the crowd would never forget. At the center of this theater stood the executioner, a figure both feared and necessary. Dressed sometimes in a hood, other times openly, he wielded the tools of death with grim expertise. Executioners were shunned in daily life, often forced to live on the outskirts of towns. Yet they held enormous power. Without them, justice could not be carried out. The skill of an executioner could mean the difference between a quick death and prolonged agony. Some were admired for their precision, others cursed for their cruelty. Payment often came in coins tossed at their feet or in the grim right to strip the clothes and belongings of the condemned. No medieval execution was complete without an audience. Crowds gathered not only for justice but for entertainment. Parents brought children, merchants sold food and drink, and musicians sometimes played as the condemned screamed. It was a carnival of death, woven into the very fabric of medieval life. The crowd's reaction varied. Some jeered and mocked, others prayed for the soul of the dying, and a few wept quietly. But all watched closely. For the execution was more than punishment, it was a reminder. The law was not words on parchment. It was blood on the ground. The journey from death row to the execution ground was itself a ritual. The condemned was paraded through the streets, chained and beaten, followed by guards, priests, and drummers. Townsfolk lined the roads, spitting, shouting, or touching the prisoner as if contact could ward off misfortune. For nobles, this procession was slower, marked with somber dignity. For common criminals, it was humiliation, sometimes forced to carry the rope that would hang them or the wood that would burn them. Every step reminded the condemned that they were walking toward an inevitable end. In this theater of death, every role was scripted. The guards dragging, the priests chanting, the executioner preparing, and the crowd watching. Together, they transformed a human life into a performance, one that etched terror deep into the collective mind. The methods may have differed, but the message was always the same. Defy the law, betray your lord, anger the church, and your body would be broken for all to see. Medieval executions were not just punishments. They were weapons of fear, woven deeply into the fabric of daily life. To understand what death row meant in the Middle Ages, we must look beyond the dungeon and the scaffold. We must examine what it did to society, to religion, and to the very souls of the people who lived under its shadow. Fear as social control. Every execution was a message. When a thief dangled from the gallows, when a heretic was burned alive, when a traitor's body was torn apart, each of these was a warning carved into flesh. This could be you. Justice in the medieval world was less about fairness and more about deterrence. Authorities knew that crime could never be fully stamped out, but fear could keep it at bay. This is why executions were public. They were staged at crossroads, marketplaces, or on hills visible for miles. No one could escape the reminder. Even if you never broke the law, the sight of a rotting corpse on a wheel or a skull on a spike haunted your dreams. The scaffold became a theater of fear, its memory lingering long after the blood was washed away. The psychological weight on the living. For the condemned, death row was a slow death before the final blow. But what of those who watched? Children grew up seeing people strangled, burned, or hacked to pieces. Adults carried those images for life. Chroniclers describe villagers unable to sleep after watching executions, haunted by screams and smells of burning flesh. And yet, people kept attending. Why? Because executions were not just about horror, they were about belonging. By witnessing punishment, people reinforced their place in society. They were law-abiding, safe, righteous. The condemned became the scapegoat upon whom the fears of the community were cast. Seeing them die meant believing justice had been done. Religion and the ritual of death. The church played a central role in every execution. Priests accompanied the condemned to the scaffold, urging repentance until the final moment. Sometimes, a dying man's last words of confession were treated as a kind of sermon, a lesson for the crowd. The church framed executions as holy justice, the punishment of sin, the purification of souls. Yet beneath this theology lay deep contradictions. If life was sacred, why did the church sanction such cruelty? Some clerics admitted discomfort. Others embraced it fully, believing that visible suffering served as divine warning. For heretics especially, execution was framed not only as punishment, but as a sacrifice, their bodies destroyed to protect the purity of the faithful. Thus, death row was not only a legal process, but a religious drama. The dungeon was the confessional, the scaffold the altar, the body of the condemned the sacrifice, the curse of the executioner. No figure embodied these contradictions more than the executioner. He was both essential and despised. Without him, justice could not be carried out. Yet he was shunned from society, forced to live on the margins, often inheriting the role through family rather than choice. Children of executioners were stigmatized, unable to marry into respectable families. And yet, executioners wielded unique power. They saw kings kneel, nobles tremble, and rebels broken. They controlled the boundary between life and death. Some grew cruel, reveling in their role. Others became strangely respected for their precision. A swift, clean death was considered a mercy, and skilled executioners were prized. Still, their hands were forever stained, their lives shadowed by the screams of the dying. When executions went wrong, not every execution went according to plan. Sometimes ropes snapped, and prisoners survived the hanging, forcing the executioner to repeat the ordeal. Fires might burn too quickly, reducing the condemned to ash before the crowd had its fill of the spectacle. Or worse, fires burned too slowly, prolonging the screams. One chronicler described a botched beheading where the axe broke mid-swing. The nobleman rose, blood streaming from his neck, and cursed the crowd before collapsing. Another record tells of a man burned at the stake who refused to die. his charred body standing upright even as the fire died down. These moments terrified witnesses, blurring the line between justice and horror. People whispered of demons, curses, or divine intervention. Such failures only deepened the sense of dread. If even death could be messy and uncertain, what hope was there for order in life? The politics of death row. Executions were not only about justice, they were also tools of politics. Kings and lords used them to crush dissent, silence rivals, and project authority. A rebel hanged in public was more than a criminal. It was a warning to all who might challenge the throne. This political use of execution explains why traitors suffered the most brutal deaths. Hanging, drawing, and quartering was not simply cruelty, it was a political message carved into bodies. Betrayal will be torn apart, limb by limb. Nobles, too, were not spared if they fell out of favor. A fallen lord might face the same scaffold as a peasant, his head displayed on a spike to remind everyone that power itself was fragile. The legacy left behind. The medieval obsession with public death left scars on history. Long after the Middle Ages, Europe retained the memory of wheels, stakes, and gallows. Even today, words like scaffold and gallows humor echo this past. The idea that punishment must be seen to be believed shaped legal traditions for centuries. But the deeper legacy was psychological. Medieval society lived with death in ways we cannot imagine. Plague, war, famine all made mortality ever-present. Executions added to that weight, normalizing brutality, teaching generations that suffering was part of life. In this world, death row was not an anomaly. It was a mirror of daily existence. The final walk. In the end, the story of medieval death row is not only about those who died, it is about those who watched, those who executed, and those who ruled. The condemned walked their final path not alone, but surrounded by priests, guards, executioners, and crowds. Their deaths were personal tragedies, but also communal rituals. Every scream, every drop of blood, every flame and broken bone was meant to bind society together in fear and obedience. And in that sense, death row in the medieval world succeeded. It kept people silent, it kept rebellion in check, and it gave rulers the terrifying aura of divine justice. But at what cost? The true price was not only the lives lost, but the humanity eroded. A world that cheered at broken bodies was a world drowning in darkness, one where compassion was buried beneath the scaffold. And so, when we ask, what did death row look like in the medieval world? The answer is simple. It looked like fear made flesh, terror turned into ritual, and cruelty disguised as justice. It looked like a society that fed on the suffering of its own people, binding itself together not through mercy, but through blood. If this journey into medieval death row shocked you, imagine the other secrets history still hides. From cursed kings to hidden crimes of emperors, we uncover the darkest corners of the past every week. Like this video, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss a story. And tell us in the comments, if you lived in the Middle Ages, which execution method would terrify you the most? Because history is not just about crowns and battles, it is about the blood spilled in silence, and the fear carved into generations.